Jamal was used to being ignored. He knew what it felt like to walk into a room and see people look right through him. But that day, at the gas station, he didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He ran. A little girl, left unattended by her distracted driver, was only a few steps away from disaster. A small flick of a lighter, a spark, a cigarette about to fall. And in that instant, Jamal did what no one else would. He lunged forward, pushing the girl away, just as the explosion erupted behind them. But instead of gratitude, instead of thanks, he was met with suspicion, with anger. Pulled away, accused, judged before anyone even bothered to hear the truth. He wasn't a hero in their eyes. He was a threat. What happens when the truth is ignored, when power and prejudice speak louder than justice? Stay until the end, because this is not just a story about what happened that day. This is about what happens next. Jamal's life is about to change, but the real question is, will they ever see him for who he really is? Before we begin, tell us, where are you watching from? Jamal stepped into the gas station, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his throat dry from the long walk home after school. He only needed a bottle of water, nothing more. As he approached the refrigerators at the back, something outside caught his attention. A little girl, no older than 5 or 6, was spinning in circles near a sleek black luxury car, giggling to herself, lost in her own world. Her golden curls bounced as she moved, her small hands pretending to grab something invisible in the air. The man who was supposed to be watching her, the driver, stood nearby, leaning against the car, his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his phone. Jamal frowned. There was something unsettling about the way she was so unattended. His gaze lowered to the ground near the vehicle, and his stomach clenched at the sight. Gasoline. A dark, shimmering pool of it had spread near the rear tire, creeping toward the gas pump. The sharp, unmistakable scent of fuel burned his nose. Then he noticed something even worse. A man just a few feet away, dressed in worn-out jeans and a hoodie, flicking a lighter open and shut, absent-mindedly. In his other hand, a cigarette dangled between his fingers, dangerously close to being lit. Jamal's body reacted before his mind could process the full weight of the situation. He bolted out of the store, his sneakers slapping against the pavement as he sprinted toward the girl. Everything around him faded. The gas station, the cars, the murmuring of people. All that existed was the girl and the immediate, undeniable danger. As he reached her, she turned, startled, her blue eyes wide with confusion. He didn't have time to explain. With every ounce of force he had, he lunged, wrapping his arms around her small frame and pushing her forward, away from the car, away from the growing pool of gasoline. She hit the ground with a startled yelp just as a sharp click sounded behind them. Jamal barely had time to register the flash of orange before the world erupted in fire. The explosion ripped through the air, deafening, blinding. The heat slammed into Jamal's back like a burning wall, searing his skin through his school uniform. He instinctively curled his body around the girl, shielding her as shards of metal and glass rained down. His ears rang, the high-pitched shriek drowning out the screams around him. The once quiet gas station had transformed into chaos. Jamal gasped for air, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. The girl whimpered beneath him, trembling like a leaf in the wind. He lifted his head, his eyes stinging from the smoke, and looked around. Flames engulfed the luxury car, the black metal, now twisted and deformed from the blast. Thick black smoke curled into the sky. People were running, some shouting, others frozen in shock. The gas station attendants fumbled with their phones, some calling for help, others too stunned to react. Jamal coughed, his throat raw, as he slowly helped the little girl sit up. "Are you hurt?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. She shook her head, her small hands clutching his shirt with a grip stronger than he expected. Tears streamed down her soot-streaked face, but she wasn't sobbing, just staring at him, her lips quivering. He opened his mouth to reassure her, but before he could say another word, a hand grabbed his arm and yanked him up. Jamal stumbled, barely catching himself as he turned to face the furious red-faced driver. The man's eyes blazed with rage, his grip on Jamal's arm tightening with alarming strength. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The driver bellowed, shaking him violently. Jamal's heart pounded. I was helping her. The car was..." But the man wasn't listening. His face twisted with suspicion, his mind already made up. "Helping her? You little..." He looked down at the girl, still, sitting on the ground, dazed. "You tried to take her, didn't you?" Jamal's stomach dropped. "No, I was saving her." But the driver wasn't hearing him. He spun around, eyes darting toward the approaching sirens. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, dragging Jamal toward the gas station entrance. The girl scrambled to her feet. "No, he saved me, he saved me." But her protests were drowned out by the growing crowd and the sheer force of the driver's anger. People whispered, eyes darting between Jamal and the burning wreckage, unsure of what to believe. A sickening weight settled in Jamal's chest. No one was listening. No one cared what really happened. Before he could struggle further, two men in sharp black suits emerged from a sleek SUV parked near the gas station's entrance. Their movements were precise, calculated. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stoic expression, nodded toward Jamal. "Take him," he said, his voice cool, devoid of emotion. The driver shoved Jamal forward, releasing him only for the suited men to grab his arms in an unrelenting grip. "You're making a mistake," Jamal gasped, struggling against them, but their hands were like steel. The little girl fought against the driver, tears streaking her cheeks. "Stop, stop, he didn't do anything." But the driver ignored her, brushing her aside as the suited men dragged Jamal toward their car. His heart pounded in his chest, panic surging through his veins. This wasn't happening. He had saved her. He had done the right thing. Why was he being treated like a criminal? As they reached the SUV, the taller man pulled out a phone and made a call. "We have him," he said into the receiver. "Mr. Caldwell will decide what happens next." Jamal's stomach twisted. Caldwell. The name sent a jolt of dread. Through him. This was bad. This was really bad. The realization hit him like another explosion. He wasn't just in trouble. He was about to be swallowed by something much bigger than he could comprehend, and no one was going to save him. Jamal's heart pounded as he struggled against the firm grip of the suited men, dragging him toward the black SUV. His voice broke through his panic as he twisted his body, trying to make them listen. "I didn't do anything. I saved her. Ask her." But his words were swallowed by the rising commotion. The gas station was still in chaos, people taking videos, whispering, staring. The wreckage of the burning luxury car behind them cast a glow on the pavement, smoke billowing into the sky. The little girl, Sophia, was still crying, her small hands clutching at her dress, trying to wipe the soot from her face. She tried to run toward Jamal, but the driver grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Stay here," he commanded. But she jerked against his hold, frustration twisting her delicate features. "No, he saved me. Let him go." Her voice, high and desperate, was drowned out by the deep rumble of a new arrival, a sleek black Rolls-Royce that pulled up with practiced ease. The back door flew open before the car had even fully stopped, and a tall man in an immaculate grey suit stepped out with a storm of fury written across his face. His presence alone made the crowd hush. Richard Caldwell had arrived. Richard's sharp eyes scanned the scene, locking onto his daughter first, then the burning car, and finally on the disheveled boy struggling against his security team. His lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw clenched so tightly the veins in his neck protruded. His daughter, his only daughter, was covered in dirt, her dress smeared with grime, standing near a stranger, a boy in tattered school clothes. His mind filled in the blanks before anyone could explain. This boy had put her in danger. This boy had tried to take her. His stomach churned with rage. "What the hell is going on?" "Here." His voice sliced through the air like a whip. The driver immediately rushed to his side, straightening his jacket as he gestured at Jamal with a disgusted expression. "Sir, This kid was carrying Sophia after the explosion. We caught him red-handed. The words solidified the assumption already. Forming in Richard's mind, he turned his fiery gaze on Jamal, stepping toward him with controlled fury, his expensive shoes clicking sharply against the pavement. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he spat, his tone venomous. "How dare you touch my daughter?" Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He had been preparing to explain, to tell Richard exactly what happened, but the way the man looked at him, like he was filth, like he was something that needed to be disposed of, made the words freeze inside him. I was saving her," he managed, his voice cracking under the weight of his own. Disbelief. How could no one see what had really happened? The car, it was leaking gas. A man lit a cigarette and Richard's expression didn't waver. His lips curled in disdain as he cut Jamal off with a sharp laugh, cold and humorless. "So now you're some kind of hero?" He stepped closer, his towering frame casting a long shadow over Jamal. "That's a convenient little story, isn't it? You just happened to be in the right place, right time, and now you expect me to believe you saved my daughter." His voice dripped with condescension, and Jamal felt his pulse spike. This man wasn't even listening. The security guards tightened their grip on him. He turned desperately to the crowd, to the people watching, searching for a face, any face that might help him. But they only stared, passive, unwilling to get involved. Sophia yanked against her driver's grip, her small body twisting as she shouted, "Daddy, he really did save me. I was by the car and then it exploded. He pushed me out of the way." But Richard barely acknowledged her words. His eyes burned into Jamal with an intensity that made his stomach twist. He shook his head, disgust curling his features. "No, you don't get to talk your way out of this," he muttered, his voice lowering but somehow growing even more dangerous. He turned to his men. "Hold him. Call the police. I want this kid arrested." The order struck Jamal like a slap. His knees nearly buckled. "What? No, I didn't do anything." But Richard wasn't looking at him anymore. He had already turned away, walking toward his daughter, crouching in front of her. "Did he touch you?" he asked softly, and Sophia's face contorted with frustration. "No, Daddy, I told you, he—" But Richard was done listening. He pulled her into his arms, brushing back her curls. His fury replaced with gentle concern, concern that only extended to her, never to the boy who had risked his life for her. A pair of police cars screeched to a stop near the gas station entrance, red and blue lights flashing wildly. Jamal's stomach turned. He had never been in trouble before, never dealt with the police, but he had heard stories. He had seen what happened to boys like him in situations like this. The moment the officers stepped out, their hands hovered near their belts. They didn't ask questions. They didn't look around at the chaos, at the burning car, at the real evidence of what had happened. No, they saw a black boy being restrained by men in suits, and that was enough. One of them, a burly man with graying hair, nodded at Richard. "Mr. Caldwell, what's the problem here?" Richard's lips twisted into a sneer as he gestured toward Jamal. "This boy tried to take my daughter." The officer's eyes locked onto Jamal, cold, assessing. "That right?" He stepped forward, reaching for the cuffs at his belt. Jamal's body tensed, panic rushing through his veins like ice. "No, that's not right. But before he could finish, Sophia finally snapped. "Stop!" Her voice rang through the air, loud and unwavering. Everyone froze. She stomped forward, breaking free from her father's hold, pointing a furious finger at the police officer. "He saved me. I would be dead if it wasn't for him. Look at the cameras. The gas station has cameras. They recorded everything." Richard's face twisted in frustration, his jaw tightening, but the damage had been done. The officer hesitated. His gaze flicked toward the gas station attendant, a man who had been watching quietly, arms crossed over his chest. Slowly, the attendant nodded. "She's right," he said. "We have footage. I saw it happen." A long silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Richard's fists clenched at his sides, his face a mask of controlled rage. The officer sighed, lowering his hands. "Guess we should take a look then." The men holding Jamal loosened their grip, their expressions shifting into something unreadable. Relief crashed into Jamal so suddenly that his knees almost gave out. But he knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. And Richard Caldwell wasn't the type of man to let things go so easily. "Come with me," the gas station attendant said firmly, gesturing for the officer to follow him. The police hesitated for a moment, exchanging glances, but ultimately nodded and followed the man toward the small office at the back of the store. Richard Caldwell, his jaw clenched tightly, walked after them, his expensive shoes clicking against the tile floor. He wasn't a man used to being questioned, let alone being made to wait for answers. Jamal remained standing near the gas pumps, his body tense, his fists clenched at his sides. The grip of the security guards had loosened, but their presence was still oppressive, as if waiting for a reason to restrain him again. He wanted to speak, to demand his innocence, but the exhaustion of being ignored, accused, and humiliated had drained him. He could only wait. Sophia, standing a few feet away, kept her eyes on her father, her small face. Defiant, Richard barely acknowledged her, too focused on what he was about to see. He prided himself on being in control of every situation. This time, however, he felt the uneasy sensation of something slipping through his fingers. Inside the small office, the gas station attendant pulled up the security footage on an old computer. The video was clear, despite the grainy quality of the screen. The moment it started playing, Richard's face remained cold and impassive, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. The officers leaned in slightly, watching as the recording showed Jamal stepping into the store, his movements casual, unaware. Then the moment unfolded again, Jamal's gaze shifting, his body tensing, his sudden sprint towards Sophia. The lighter flicked on in the background, the cigarette about to ignite. Then, in a split second, Jamal lunged, pushing the girl out of the way. Just before the explosion engulfed the car, the screen flickered as flames erupted, debris scattering across the station. Richard's fingers curled against his forearm, gripping his own sleeve as he watched. The officers said nothing, their once skeptical expressions shifting into something unreadable. The video continued, showing how, even after the blast, Jamal had shielded Sophia with his own body, instinctively protecting her from the raining shards of glass and fire. Then, the moment where Richard's own driver had grabbed the boy, violently, unfairly, while Jamal had still been dazed from the explosion. The attendant folded his arms, turning to the officers. "Well," he said, his tone heavy with meaning, "that's what really happened." The silence that followed was thick. One of the officers exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Damn," he muttered under his breath. The officer who had first reached for his cuffs now stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just seen. Slowly, both turned to look at Jamal, still standing outside. The same boy they had been moments away from arresting. Richard remained stiff, his face unreadable, but his fingers twitched slightly at his sides. His own prejudices had convinced him of something that never happened. The weight of it pressed down on him in an unfamiliar way. He wasn't a man accustomed to feeling wrong. He didn't know how to react to it. The moment stretched, uncomfortable, until one of the officers finally spoke. "Kid," he called, stepping out of the office. Jamal turned sharply, expecting more accusations, more disbelief. Instead, the officer hesitated, then gave a stiff nod. "You're free to go." Jamal blinked. For a second, he didn't move, as if waiting for some kind of trick, another accusation, another attempt to take him down. But no one stopped him. The security guards who had been holding him captive now stood awkwardly, unsure of what to do. The crowd, which had been murmuring in speculation, had grown eerily quiet, their earlier judgments hanging heavy in the air. Slowly, Jamal straightened, his breath unsteady. He wasn't relieved, he wasn't even angry, he was just tired. Richard stepped forward, his face tight, unreadable. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, uncertainty, hesitation, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. He reached into his suit pocket, pulling out a thick wad of cash, crisp and neatly stacked. Without a word, he held it out toward Jamal, an offering, a way to erase the discomfort gnawing at his conscience. "Take it," he said, his voice firm, controlled. "For what you did." Jamal stared at the money, then up at Richard's face. He saw nothing in the man's expression but the same cold calculation, the same desire to settle things the way men like him always did, with money, with transactions. Jamal didn't reach for it. The moment stretched, heavy with tension, until Jamal let out a quiet breath and shook his head. "I don't want your money," he said simply. Richard's fingers twitched, gripping the cash tighter. He wasn't used to people rejecting what he offered, wasn't used to people standing in front of him without fear. "What do you want then?" he asked, his tone sharp, impatient. Jamal lifted his chin slightly, his shoulders squaring. "Respect," he said. "That's all." The words landed between them, heavier than any bill Richard could have placed in his hand. A muscle in Richard's jaw tensed. He had expected gratitude, expected an easy fix, but instead, this boy, this child, had just done something few dared to do. He had refused him, and somehow that unsettled him more than the video had. Sophia, standing nearby, watched the exchange with wide eyes. Then, suddenly, a small smile curled on her lips. She stepped forward, placing her tiny hand in Jamal's, squeezing his fingers lightly. "I want to see you again," she said, her voice softer than before but full of certainty. Richard's head snapped toward her, his mouth opening slightly in protest, but she turned her face up to him with an expression that was unwavering. "He's my friend," she declared. The words hit Richard like a blow. His daughter, his precious daughter, saw this boy not as a threat, not as an enemy, but as someone she admired. He couldn't argue with her without betraying the truth she had already realized. Jamal looked down at Sophia, his expression softening, and he gave her hand a small squeeze back. "I'd like that," he admitted. And for the first time since the explosion, a real smile touched his lips. Richard turned away slightly, his jaw still tight, his mind reeling. For the first time in years, he didn't have an immediate response, a quick solution, a way to wrap things up neatly. He had been so certain, so confident in his own assumptions, and now he had been made to face the truth, an uncomfortable, undeniable truth. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to react. So for once in his life, he said nothing at all. The following afternoon, Jamal sat at the small wooden table in his family's cramped living room, absent-mindedly running a finger along the chipped edges. His mother stood by the sink, her back to him, drying dishes with slow, deliberate movements. He knew she wasn't just focused on the plates. She was thinking about everything that had happened, about the fire, the accusations, and the unexpected shift in how the world had suddenly noticed her son. Jamal was still processing it himself. One day ago, he had been treated like a criminal, his words ignored, his actions twisted into something sinister. Now, as he stared at the threadbare rug beneath his feet, a black luxury car rolled to a stop outside their home. He stiffened. He didn't need to look to know who it was. A slow exhale left his lips. Richard Caldwell had come to their doorstep. His mother placed the last plate on the drying rack and turned, her sharp eyes locking onto the car just as the door opened. Without a word, she wiped her hands on her apron and stepped toward the front door. Jamal swallowed hard, pushing back his chair as she reached for the knob. The door swung open before she could knock, revealing Richard standing there in a perfectly pressed suit, his expression unreadable. He held himself with the same composed arrogance he had the day before, but there was something different in his eyes. Hesitation, maybe even discomfort. Jamal stayed back, observing, waiting. His mother crossed her arms, her face giving nothing away. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone even. Richard met her gaze, his posture straight, his voice steady. "I'd like to speak with you about your son." A flicker of something passed through her expression, but she didn't move aside. Jamal watched as his mother, a woman who had spent her entire life protecting him from men like Richard, assessed the billionaire standing in her doorway. After a long pause, she stepped back, allowing him in. Richard entered, his gaze sweeping over the modest home, the second-hand furniture, the framed photos lining the wall, the worn fabric of the couch. It was a world entirely different from his own. He didn't comment on it. Instead, he turned to Jamal's mother and spoke plainly. "I want to help your son." Jamal stiffened. He hadn't expected this, hadn't even imagined that Richard Caldwell would come back after what happened. He waited for his mother to respond, but she didn't. She simply watched Richard, her silence pressing him to continue. Richard cleared his throat, shifting slightly, clearly unaccustomed to explaining himself. "Yesterday I made a mistake, a serious one." He glanced at Jamal briefly before continuing. "I assumed things about him that weren't true, and I won't pretend an apology is enough to fix that." His hands slipped into his pockets, his demeanor controlled, but lacking the confidence he had before. "That being said, I want to offer him something real, a scholarship, full tuition, all expenses covered, the best school in the city." His words landed heavily in the room. Jamal's mother narrowed her eyes. "And why exactly do you want to do that?" she asked, her voice cool, skeptical. Richard exhaled through his nose, considering his words. "Because it's what he deserves." Jamal's jaw clenched. He should have felt grateful, should have jumped at the opportunity, but all he could think about was the way Richard had looked at him just a day ago, like he was nothing. Jamal shifted in his chair, his hands tightening into fists on his lap. "And why should I accept?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended, but firm nonetheless. "You didn't respect me before. You wouldn't even listen. What makes you think I'd want anything from you now?" Richard met his gaze, his own expression unreadable. For a moment the room was silent, tension crackling in the air between them. Jamal's mother watched, waiting, letting the question hang. Then, surprisingly, Richard nodded slightly. "You're right," he admitted. The words sounded foreign coming from his mouth, but they were steady. "You don't owe me anything, and I don't expect you to take this offer for me." His shoulders straightened. "But don't let your anger at me stop you from taking what could be a life-changing opportunity." Jamal exhaled sharply, looking away. His mother studied Richard carefully, her lips pressing into a thin line. "He won't take anything out of pity," she said finally. "If my son goes to that school, he goes as an equal. No charity, no favors." Richard hesitated, but then gave a single nod. "Agreed." A sudden burst of movement made them all turn. Sophia had darted into the house, slipping past the driver who had been waiting outside. She grinned at Jamal, her face bright with excitement. "You're coming to my school," she declared, as if the decision had already been made. Jamal blinked, caught off guard. But she wasn't listening. "You saved my life. That makes you my friend, and I want my friends to be where I am." She turned to her father expectantly. "Right. Daddy?" Richard's jaw tightened slightly, but then he sighed, shaking his head. "It's up to him," he muttered. Sophia spun back to Jamal, waiting. Jamal hesitated, uncertainty twisting in his stomach. He had spent his whole life being looked down on, treated as less. Even if he accepted, would anything change? Would he really belong in that world? But then he looked at Sophia. She didn't see him the way her father had. She saw him as a hero, a friend. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Jamal looked at his mother. She didn't speak, but her eyes held something he recognized: trust. Trust that he would make the right decision for himself. He turned back to Richard, his spine straightening. "I'll go," he said slowly, "but not as a favor. Not because you feel guilty. I go because I earned it." Richard studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. "Then we have a deal." Jamal hesitated, but then, with steady confidence, he reached out and shook it. The deal was made, but something deeper had shifted in that room. Something neither of them could quite name yet. Jamal stepped through the grand entrance of the school, his backpack slung over his shoulder, his chin lifted despite the weight pressing on his chest. The hallways stretched endlessly, lined with pristine white walls, adorned with framed awards, accolades, and portraits of past alumni, generations of privilege, wealth, and legacy. His worn sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floors, an unintentional reminder that he didn't belong. The moment he stepped inside, the whispers began. Groups of students, dressed in crisp uniforms, exchanged looks, their eyes flicking toward him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Some barely bothered to lower their voices. "Who is he?" one girl murmured to her friend. "He's the kid from the explosion," another boy scoffed. "You mean the charity case?" The words stung, but Jamal refused to let them settle. He had expected this. He had spent his whole life navigating spaces where he wasn't wanted. This was just another place, another test. He wasn't here for them. He was here for himself. Sophia appeared beside him, grinning as if oblivious to the murmurs. "Come on," she said, linking her arm through his without hesitation. "I want to show you everything." As the days passed, Jamal learned the true challenge of being in this school wasn't just the coursework. It was the constant need to prove himself. He was smart, he knew that, but intelligence alone wasn't enough to silence the sneers of students who believed money equaled superiority. In every classroom, every discussion, every test, he could feel the unspoken expectations weighing on him. Some teachers looked at him with polite indifference, others with barely concealed skepticism. But Jamal didn't falter. He answered questions with precision, wrote essays that forced his instructors to pause, and tackled equations that left some of the wealthiest students glancing at him with begrudging respect. He wasn't just here to occupy space, he was here to succeed. Sophia, ever unwavering, sat beside him at lunch, despite the raised eyebrows. When students made snide remarks, she met them with a sharp glare. "You're all just mad because he's smarter than you," she said one afternoon, slamming her juice carton onto the table. Jamal smirked but shook his head. "I don't need you fighting my battles." She rolled her eyes. "Too bad. I like fighting." Not everyone was as accepting. One afternoon, in a history class discussion, Jamal raised his hand to challenge a point made by a well-known, respected professor. The man paused, eyeing him with an expression that sent a clear message. "Know your place." He sighed, setting his book down. "That's a very interesting perspective, Mr. Evans," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "But I think perhaps you're not quite grasping the nuances of—" "He's right," another student interrupted. One of the top students in the class, no less. The professor blinked, momentarily thrown. The room fell silent, waiting. Slowly, Jamal leaned back in his seat, folding his arms. He didn't need to say anything more. The professor cleared his throat and moved on, but the shift in the room was undeniable. The same students who once whispered about him were now watching him differently. Begrudgingly, some of them were, beginning to see what Sophia had seen from the start. Jamal wasn't just here, he belonged here. Richard Caldwell sat in the headmaster's office, his fingers drumming lightly against the desk as he listened to the principal's concerns. "Jamal is undoubtedly intelligent," the man admitted, shifting in his seat. "But there have been difficulties with integration. Some students struggle to accept someone from a different background." Richard tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You mean some students are struggling with their own entitlement," he corrected smoothly. The principal, "Yes, sir," hesitated but didn't deny it. "It's a delicate situation." Richard exhaled, his mind recalling the version of himself from just days ago, the man who had once looked at Jamal with the same judgment. Now, the idea disgusted him. He rose to his feet. "Then it's a situation you'll need to fix." His tone left no room for debate. Later that week, Richard found himself near the entrance of the school, just as a small scene unfolded. A different professor, a stern man with graying hair and a perpetual scowl, had stopped Jamal in the hallway. "You may be here now," the professor said coolly, "but let's not pretend you're like the rest of the students." Jamal's jaw tensed, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the space. "You're right." Richard Caldwell stepped forward, his presence turning heads immediately. "He's not like the rest of them." The professor stiffened. "Mr. Caldwell, Richard didn't let him finish. "He works harder," he continued, his voice carrying through the hallway. "He doesn't have the luxury of assuming he'll always succeed. He earns his place every day." The professor swallowed hard, clearly thrown. "I didn't mean—" "But you did," Richard interrupted. "And I suggest you think very carefully before speaking to him that way again." He turned his gaze to Jamal, who stood frozen, struggling to process what had just happened. Richard gave him a single nod before walking away. The hallway buzzed with murmurs. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, Jamal found himself not just surviving, but thriving. The whispers lessened. The stares became less judgmental, replaced by something else: curiosity, respect, even admiration. The students who once dismissed him as an outsider now found themselves competing against him in class, realizing he wasn't just smart, he was exceptional. Sophia remained his anchor, but Jamal no longer needed her to shield him. He had carved his own space, forcing the world around him to adjust. Even Richard changed. He still carried the arrogance of a man used to getting his way, but his perspective had shifted. He watched Jamal with something different in his eyes. Not pity, not skepticism, pride. For the first time, Richard Caldwell saw someone not defined by their past, but by their potential. One afternoon, as Jamal packed up his books, Sophia grinned at him. "You proved them wrong," he smirked, slinging his bag over his shoulder. "I didn't need to. I just needed them to see the truth." As they walked down the grand steps of the school together, Richard stood near his car, watching them. He met Jamal's gaze, and for the first time, the nod he gave wasn't one of obligation, it was one of true respect. Jamal returned it, his step steady, his path clear. He had come from a place where people like Richard never saw him. Now, not only had he been seen, he had changed the view entirely. What an incredible story, right? What touched you the most in this episode? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. We love hearing from you. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. Stories like this take days to create with great care, and your support makes all the difference in helping us bring you more special content. Thank you for being with us, and see you in the next one.